The sun had just begun its descent behind the trees, casting long, slanted shadows that stretched over the sleepy suburban streets. A faint breeze rustled the leaves, but the air was still. The kind of quiet that made you feel like something was about to happen, like the calm before a storm. Dave, the pizza delivery driver, rolled down his window, breathing in the cool evening air as he navigated his old but reliable sedan down the winding streets of the gated community. His car was a familiar sight in these parts, delivering hot, cheesy comfort to the residents of this upscale cul-de-sac. Tonight, Dave had the usual load of pepperoni, extra cheese, and a few specialty orders. He glanced down at the address on the receipt, Hollycrest Lane, house number 7. He'd been here dozens of times before, always to the same immaculately kept home at the end of the street. There was something almost eerie about the place. Perfectly trimmed hedges, a pristine driveway, and the smell of freshly mowed grass lingering in the air. It looked like it belonged in a magazine. But beyond its picture-perfect exterior, it was a house that belonged to Karen, the very definition of a nightmare neighbor. As Dave slowed to a stop in front of the large gates, his headlights flickered across the perfectly symmetrical landscaping of the front yard. He hadn't thought much about Karen before. She was just one of those demanding customers who always seemed to find something wrong with every delivery. She had a particular disdain for delivery drivers parking near her house, as if they were somehow tarnishing the illusion of perfection she had so carefully curated. But tonight felt different. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the eerie quietness of the street, the stillness in the air, or the fact that it had been a long day. But as Dave parked and grabbed the stack of pizzas from the backseat, something tugged at him. He had no idea that in just a few moments, this routine delivery would spiral into something far more bizarre and dangerous than he ever imagined. He made his way up the stone walkway, the sound of his boots echoing in the otherwise silent night. He rang the doorbell, and almost immediately, the door swung open. Karen stood there, her face painted with that signature look of self-righteousness, as if she were royalty and he the lowly servant. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned him up and down. "Delivery," Dave said, keeping his voice as neutral as possible. "Who are you?" Karen's voice was sharp, cutting through the calm of the evening. Her eyes darted from his face to the car parked at the curb, and back to him. "You know the rules, right? No cars allowed to park here unless you're an invited guest. You're breaking the neighborhood rules, again." Dave's brow furrowed. "What?" He was just delivering pizza. "Ma'am, I'm just doing my job. I'm delivering to." "I don't care who you're delivering to," she snapped, cutting him off. "There are rules in this neighborhood. You will not park here without my permission." Her eyes were hard, unblinking. Karen was the kind of person who thought she could bend everyone to her will, especially when it came to enforcing the HOA's rules with an iron fist. Dave glanced over his shoulder. No one else was around. The street was quiet, eerily quiet, in fact. The wind seemed to have died completely, as if the world was holding its breath. His car, a nondescript sedan, sat innocuously by the curb, just like it always had when he delivered here before. But tonight, Karen was in full control, and her words were loaded with venom. She took a step closer, her phone already in hand. "If you don't leave immediately, I'll be calling the police. You're trespassing on my property, and I'm tired of people like you ruining the peace of my neighborhood. This is my street," she hissed, pointing a finger at him. A shiver ran down Dave's spine. Was she serious? He had never seen a neighbor this combative over something as simple as a pizza delivery. But there was no mistaking it. Karen was poised for a confrontation, and she wasn't going to let go of her authority without a fight. "I'm just here to deliver the food," Dave said, trying to keep his tone calm, but he could feel the temperature of the moment rising. His eyes shifted between the house, the ominous shadows of the cul-de-sac, and the cold, determined look on Karen's face. Before he could say anything else, Karen pressed a button on her phone with an almost theatrical flourish. "This is not just a simple delivery," she muttered under her breath, her finger tapping furiously at the screen. "You're going to regret this." At that moment, Dave knew this wasn't going to be a normal delivery. And as the words police and trespassing floated in the air, he had a sinking feeling that things were about to get out of control. The oppressive silence of the street suddenly seemed more like a ticking clock, counting down to something inevitable. And all he could do was stand there, holding the pizza, as Karen's call to the police echoed in the distance, setting off a chain of events that would change everything. The calm before the storm was over, and the storm was just beginning. The tension hung in the air like a thick fog, smothering the night. Dave stood frozen, the warm pizza boxes now a heavy weight in his hands, his heart racing in his chest. The cool evening air, once refreshing, now felt suffocating as Karen's eyes locked onto him with a gleam of relentless determination. It was clear now. This wasn't just about parking or a simple misunderstanding. She wasn't going to let this go. He could feel the weight of her gaze, sharp as a blade, as she punched in a number on her phone with force. "Hello, yes, this is an urgent matter." Karen's voice was filled with icy conviction as she spoke into the receiver. "I have an unauthorized vehicle parked in front of my property. This is a violation of HOA rules. This delivery driver is trespassing, and he's causing a disturbance." Dave's jaw clenched. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The disturbance. He was just doing his job, delivering pizza to someone who had ordered it. Yet here he was, on the verge of being arrested for something as ridiculous as following his daily routine. He glanced nervously down the street, his stomach tight with unease. Karen's house, with its immaculately manicured lawn and pristine white fence, stood like a fortress against the encroaching night, a fortress that would do anything to maintain its spotless image. "Ma'am," Dave spoke up, trying to stay calm, though his voice betrayed a hint of frustration. "I'm just delivering food. This isn't a crime." Karen ignored him, her finger tapping furiously on the screen of her phone, her eyes never leaving him. The street felt unnaturally quiet now, as if the entire neighborhood had fallen into a collective breathless pause. The silence was only broken by the distant, haunting sound of a siren slowly making its way toward them. The flashing red and blue lights of the police car would soon cut through the calm night, like a harbinger of chaos. Suddenly, a movement caught Dave's eye, a shadow from the corner of his vision. His pulse quickened as a figure emerged from one of the neighboring houses. It was Mr. Thompson, an older man who had lived in the cul-de-sac for years. He was walking toward them with purpose, a deep frown etched across his face as he approached Karen's property. Dave felt a small wave of relief, hoping the presence of another neighbor might diffuse the situation. "Karen, what are you doing?" Mr. Thompson's voice was low, but it carried a note of disbelief. He had seen Dave make deliveries here before. He knew the routine. This wasn't like Karen to make a fuss over something so trivial. "You're really calling the cops over a pizza delivery?" Karen whirled around, her eyes blazing. "He's parked illegally. He's disturbing the peace, and I won't let this go." She turned back to Dave, her face now flushed with anger. "You're breaking the rules. You're not even supposed to be here. I'm calling the police, and you're going to pay the price for this." Mr. Thompson shook his head, his voice becoming more forceful. "Karen, this is getting out of hand. He's just doing his job. You can't just call the cops on someone for parking their car to deliver food." Karen's lips twisted into a cruel smile. "I can, and I will. He's trespassing. If you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem." Her words felt like daggers, each one designed to cut, to intimidate, to isolate. Dave stood there, unable to believe what he was hearing. Every inch of his body screamed at him to leave, to walk away, to just get back in his car and drive off. But he was trapped, and as Karen raised her phone to her ear once again, he realized the storm was about to break. The red and blue lights of the squad car suddenly flashed around the corner, the sharp staccato of the siren ringing in his ears. The officer was already pulling up to the curb, the wheels of the squad car screeching against the pavement as it came to a halt. As the police officer stepped out, the night seemed to hold its breath. The officer was tall, his uniform dark against the glow of the streetlights, and his face was set in a neutral expression. He glanced between Karen and Dave, assessing the scene with professional detachment. Karen wasted no time. She launched into her rehearsed spiel, her voice dripping with a feigned sense of righteousness. "Officer, this man is trespassing. He parked in front of my house without permission, and now he refuses to leave. He's disturbing the peace, and I demand that you remove him from my property immediately." The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly taking in the absurdity of the situation. He glanced at Dave, who stood there, still holding the stack of pizzas, his nerves on edge, but his posture calm. "Ma'am," the officer finally spoke, his voice steady and measured. "I don't think there's much I can do here. This is a public street, and a pizza delivery is not a crime. He's not breaking any laws by parking here." Karen's face reddened. "But he's violating the HOA rules," she insisted, her voice rising in pitch. The officer gave her a long, appraising look, then turned his attention back to Dave. "I think we're done here," he said, his tone firm, but not unkind. The words hung in the air like a judgment. Karen opened her mouth to argue, but the officer cut her off. "Ma'am, unless you have an actual crime to report, I'm going to have to ask you to let the man do his job." The cold, hard weight of the officer's words made the air around them shift. Dave felt a spark of hope flicker in his chest, but Karen wasn't done yet. She stepped forward, her body rigid with fury. "This isn't over," she muttered, her eyes flicking toward Dave with seething anger. "I'll make sure you regret this." Dave could feel the heat of her gaze burning into his back as he made his way to the door of the house. His hand trembled slightly, but he steadied himself. The pizza had to be delivered, but as he handed over the boxes, he couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't finished. The storm was only just beginning. The air felt thick, as if it was on the verge of breaking, and Dave couldn't shake the sensation that something was about to snap. He stepped back from the door, turning slowly to face Karen one last time. The police officer, still present but now standing by his car with arms crossed, watched the scene unfold like an uninterested spectator. Karen's gaze followed Dave, sharp as a predator honing in on its prey. The tension between them could be felt in the pulse of the night air, every beat of his heart in sync with the rising unease in his chest. He held his breath, his fingers still clutching the edge of the pizza bags. Karen's sharp eyes drilled into him with unyielding intensity. "Don't think this is over," she muttered, her voice low but full of venom. "I'll have your job for this. I'm calling your boss." Dave's pulse quickened, but he didn't respond. He was well acquainted with the entitled rage of homeowners like Karen, who thought their money and influence gave them the right to control everything around them. But this time, it was different. He had done nothing wrong. All he had done was deliver a pizza, yet Karen had turned it into a spectacle. "Ma'am," the officer spoke again, his tone clipped. "You're not getting anywhere with this. You called us for a non-issue. There's nothing illegal here." But Karen wasn't about to back down. "I don't care about your rules, officer," she snapped, her voice taking on a shrill edge. "You don't understand. This man is a threat to our community. He's an intruder." Dave took a step back. He could feel her eyes burning through him, the weight of her disdain almost suffocating. He had to get away from her before she dragged this any further. But before he could turn to leave, Karen's voice rang out again, sharp like a whip. "You." She pointed directly at him, a smirk curling at the corners of her lips. "I'm reporting you to your manager right now, and if you think this is the end, you're wrong. I'll make sure you never deliver in this neighborhood again. You're a threat." That word, threat, hung in the air between them, its sharp edge digging deeper into Dave's nerves. He could feel his frustration growing, mixing with the anxiety that had settled deep in his stomach. He had tried to walk away, but Karen was relentless. She had always thought she could control people with her words, and right now, she was wielding her words like daggers aimed straight for his heart. Dave took a slow, deliberate breath. He knew he couldn't let her win. Not here. Not now. The officer might not be able to help him much longer. After all, Karen had a way of wearing people down with her relentless persistence. But Dave had something she didn't expect: patience. Instead of getting angry or defensive, he met Karen's gaze head-on. His eyes locked onto hers, steady and unwavering. He knew he had to stay calm, or she would see it as a weakness. His fingers tightened around the pizza boxes as if they were his anchor, holding him in place as the storm raged around him. "You know," he said, his voice calm but sharp, "you've been talking a lot about rules, Karen. But I've been in this neighborhood more times than I can count. I've never had a single issue until tonight. Maybe, just maybe, the problem isn't with me, but with the way we're treating people. Ever think about that?" Karen's eyes flashed with anger, but Dave didn't flinch. He took another step forward, just enough to make sure she felt the weight of his words. "I'm here doing my job. I'm not a criminal. And if you think I'm going to just roll over and take your threats, you're mistaken." There was a beat of silence, as if the entire street was holding its breath. The officer watched the exchange with an unreadable expression, his arms still folded across his chest, but the look on his face was almost one of amusement. He had heard it all before: neighbors with petty grievances, people who thought they could control others through fear. But what Karen didn't realize was that Dave wasn't intimidated. Not by her, not by her threats. He was done being pushed around. Karen opened her mouth to fire back, but before she could, the officer raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Enough," he said firmly, his voice calm but unmistakably authoritative. "This isn't a crime. He's not breaking any laws. And if you keep pushing this, Karen, I'm going to have to leave." He turned toward Dave, offering him a nod of understanding. "You're free to go. There's no need for you to stay here any longer." For a moment, Karen stood there, seething with frustration. Her face was red, her hands shaking with the effort it took to hold herself back. She could feel her control slipping, and it enraged her. But the officer wasn't backing down. He had made his decision. With a final furious look at Dave, Karen stormed back into her house, slamming the door with a force that rattled the windows. The street suddenly felt a little quieter, the oppressive weight of her presence dissipating into the night air. Dave let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He turned toward the officer, who gave him a brief, appreciative smile. "She's a tough one," the officer muttered, shaking his head. "But you handled yourself well. You didn't let her get under your skin." Dave gave a small, rueful chuckle. "I've dealt with my fair share of Karens, but I didn't expect it to be like this tonight." The officer nodded, his expression softening. "I get it. It's the kind of thing that can ruin a night. But you did the right thing." As Dave finally made his way back to his car, he felt a sense of strange relief wash over him. But even as he slid into the driver's seat, starting the engine, one thought kept echoing in his mind. Karen wasn't done. No, this was only the beginning. He had no idea just how far she would go to make his life miserable, but he was sure as hell ready for whatever came next. The engine of Dave's car rumbled to life, the vibrations reverberating through the seats. His fingers gripped the steering wheel, still tense, as he slowly pulled away from Karen's pristine front yard. The last remnants of the encounter hung in the air, a feeling of unfinished business that refused to dissipate. The evening had begun like any other delivery, but now it felt like the calm before a storm, one that Dave could feel brewing, even as he made his way down the quiet suburban street. His headlights sliced through the darkness as he navigated the winding roads, the shadows of trees dancing across the pavement. The officer's words echoed in his mind. "You did the right thing." But Dave wasn't so sure. He could still feel Karen's eyes boring into him, her voice ringing with anger. No, this wasn't over. She wouldn't let it go that easily. As he turned onto the main road and picked up speed, his phone buzzed on the passenger seat. The screen lit up with a message that made his stomach drop. "Dave, we need to talk. Call me." It was a text from his boss, Tony. Dave's heart skipped a beat. He knew it had to be about the incident with Karen. There was no way she wasn't going to report him to his manager, especially after the confrontation had escalated the way it did. The idea of getting in trouble over something so trivial made his blood boil, but he couldn't avoid it. With a reluctant sigh, he tapped the number into his phone and pressed it to his ear, bracing for the worst. "Hey, Tony," Dave said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the tension in his chest. "Dave." Tony's voice came through the speaker, sharp and direct. "What the hell happened with the Karen on Hollocrest Lane? I just got a complaint saying you were harassing one of our customers." Dave's stomach clenched. "Harassing? I was just delivering her pizza, man. She freaked out because I parked in front of her house. Then she called the cops on me. I did everything by the book. Look, I don't know what's going on over there, but we got to take these complaints seriously. You need to smooth things over, or I might have to rethink your delivery route. Understand?" Tony's tone softened slightly, but the warning was clear. Dave's grip on the wheel tightened. "You've got to be kidding me. I've been doing this job for years, and now I'm being punished for delivering a pizza." "Just get it under control," Tony snapped, his patience thinning. "I don't want to hear any more about this. Karen's a big customer for us, so handle it, and don't make me deal with her directly." The call ended abruptly, leaving Dave in a fog of frustration and disbelief. The adrenaline that had been pulsing through his veins since the encounter with Karen now settled into an ugly feeling of defeat. This wasn't just about the pizza anymore. It was about the power dynamic that Karen held over him. Even from behind her polished white gates, he was just another cog in the wheel, and she had found a way to make him spin on her terms. As he continued driving, the weight of the situation began to sink in. Dave had tried to do the right thing, to defuse the situation, but it had only backfired. Karen had the leverage, and he was stuck in a vicious cycle of appeasing her in order to avoid losing his job. Just as Dave was about to turn into his neighborhood, his phone buzzed again. This time, the number on the screen wasn't from his boss. It was a local number he didn't recognize. Curiosity piqued, he answered. "Hello. Is this Dave?" The voice on the other end was a deep, unfamiliar tone. "I'm Brad, a neighbor from Hollocrest Lane. I saw what happened with Karen, and I think you should know something." Dave's brow furrowed. "But yeah, I'm the delivery driver. What's going on?" "Listen, I don't know what she told you, but that woman's got a history of pulling stunts like this," Brad continued, his voice low and conspiratorial. "She's the kind of person who thinks she can control everything in this neighborhood. The HOA, the neighbors, the delivery people, you name it." Dave's pulse quickened. Could this guy be an ally? Was there someone who actually saw through Karen's carefully crafted facade? Brad went on, his words coming faster now. "She's been pushing around the rest of the neighborhood for months, trying to get people fined for the smallest things, filing complaints about people's lawns, their cars. She even got a guy fired last month just for parking in front of her house while he was visiting a friend." Dave gripped the wheel tighter. "She got someone fired." Brad's voice was tinged with frustration. "Yep, all because she didn't like where he parked. That's Karen for you. She's got a whole list of people she's gone after. But the thing is, not everyone is as scared of her as she thinks." Dave's mind raced. This was exactly the kind of information he needed. "So you're telling me that everyone she's targeted has just rolled over for her?" Brad laughed bitterly. "More or less. But I can tell you this, there's a few of us who are fed up. We're not letting her get away with it anymore." Dave's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, fed up? Are you saying there's something we can do?" Brad paused for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was filled with a newfound determination. "It's time someone put Karen in her place. You're not the only one she's messed with, and I think it's about time we make sure she knows she's not invincible." A spark of hope flared inside Dave. Was this his chance to take back control? Could he find a way to make Karen realize that her power was nothing more than a house of cards, ready to come crashing down? "I'm listening," Dave said, his voice steady. Brad's response was a quiet but resolute promise. "Get ready, Dave. We're about to make this a lot more interesting." The ripples of the confrontation with Karen were just beginning to spread, and as Dave drove home that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something far bigger than a simple pizza delivery. The game was on. And this time, Karen wouldn't be the one calling the shots. Dave's mind was a whirlpool of thoughts as he pulled into his driveway, the cool night air hitting his face like a slap. The weight of Brad's words echoed in his ears, reverberating with an urgency he couldn't shake. "Get ready," Brad had said. "We're about to make this a lot more interesting." But what did that even mean? What could they do? How far could they push back against someone like Karen, who seemed to wield her influence like a weapon? Dave's heart raced with a mix of fear and excitement. Something was happening, and it was bigger than anything he could have imagined. As he stepped out of his car and made his way to his front door, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email notification from his company. Subject line: "Urgent. Customer complaint regarding delivery." His stomach churned. He knew it had to be about Karen. The thought of losing his job over this petty feud made his blood boil, but there was nothing he could do about it. Not yet, anyway. He pushed the door open and tossed his keys onto the counter, heading straight for his computer. Opening the email, his eyes quickly scanned the contents, the familiar, sterile language of corporate bureaucracy jumping off the screen. "Dear Dave, we regret to inform you that a formal complaint has been filed by a customer on Hollycrest Lane. The customer has reported an incident in which you allegedly violated HOA parking regulations, causing disruption to the neighborhood. This is a serious matter. We urge you to resolve this with the customer directly. Failure to do so could result in disciplinary action. Please keep us informed of the outcome." The words blurred together, but the underlying message was clear. Karen was not only determined to make him pay, but she was doing everything in her power to ensure he did. The realization sank in like a heavy stone. The very customer he had delivered to, who was supposed to be satisfied with her pizza, was the one trying to destroy him. But there was no time to dwell on it. Dave's phone buzzed again, and his screen lit up with a message from Brad. "Meet me at the park, 8:30 a.m. sharp. Bring everything you've got." Everything. What the hell was Brad talking about? But before Dave could think it through, he realized that this was his shot, his chance to turn the tables. This wasn't just about a pizza delivery anymore. It was about taking back control. The following morning, as the sun crept over the horizon, Dave found himself parked at the edge of the local park. He stepped out of his car, scanning the empty playground and surrounding trees, his eyes searching for any sign of Brad. It was eerily quiet, but the weight of anticipation hung heavy in the air. Something big was coming, and Dave wasn't sure he was ready for it, but he had no choice. A figure emerged from the shadows near the park bench. Brad, his face serious, his steps purposeful. Without a word, he motioned for Dave to follow him, leading him down a narrow, tree-lined path that wound through the park like a secret passage. "You're wondering what I meant by everything," Brad said, his voice low but filled with intent. Dave nodded, his mind still racing. "Yeah, I don't get it. What are we doing here?" Brad stopped and turned to face him, his eyes gleaming with quiet determination. "We're building a case," he said. "Karen's been getting away with this for too long. It's time someone put an end to it." Dave felt his stomach tighten with both excitement and unease. "A case? How?" Brad smiled darkly. "We're going to gather evidence. Evidence that Karen's been abusing her position in the HOA, threatening people and causing chaos in the neighborhood. She thinks she can intimidate anyone who crosses her path, but that ends now." Dave's head spun as Brad continued. "I've got neighbors who've been keeping notes on her for months. I've got photos, texts, recordings. Everything she's done to try and ruin people's lives over petty complaints. And we're going to make sure the whole neighborhood knows what she's really like." Dave couldn't believe it. A part of him had wanted to fight back. But this was something else entirely. They weren't just standing up to Karen. They were going to expose her. It felt like a war. And suddenly, Dave was right in the middle of it. "You think this will work?" Dave asked, his voice thick with skepticism. Brad chuckled. "It has to. We're not just fighting for you. We're fighting for everyone she's hurt. The whole damn neighborhood's fed up with her. All we need is one spark to light the fire." The weight of his words hung in the air, settling over Dave like a heavy blanket. He was about to step into a battle he hadn't asked for, but now that he was here, there was no turning back. It wasn't just about his job anymore. It was about standing up for what was right and taking down the tyrant who had made so many lives miserable. Brad handed him a thick folder, its contents clearly detailed. Photos of Karen's various confrontations, screenshots of her threatening emails, a list of complaints she had filed, each page a testament to her overreach, to her self-appointed role as judge, jury, and executioner in the neighborhood. As Dave looked down at the folder, a fire ignited in his chest. He could feel the anger, the injustice, rising to the surface. They weren't just going to take this lying down. "No more games," Dave muttered under his breath. He looked up at Brad, his resolve solidifying. "Let's bring her down." Brad gave him a sharp nod, his expression a mixture of determination and confidence. "We'll take her down, but we need to move quickly. She's not going to stop, and neither are we." As the two men walked out of the park together, the wind seemed to shift, carrying with them the promise of a battle that was about to unfold. Dave had a feeling that Karen's reign of terror was coming to an end, but he didn't yet know just how far the consequences would reach. He only knew one thing for sure: the war had begun. And this time, it was personal. Dave's heart pounded as he and Brad made their way back to their cars, the folder heavy in his hands. The weight of it seemed to drag at him, but it wasn't the folder that made him feel like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. It was the reality of what they were about to do. He had crossed a line, a point of no return. There was no turning back now. Brad's car was parked at the edge of the park, the sun just starting to rise above the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. "We've got to be strategic about this," Brad said, his voice calm but sharp with purpose. "We can't just throw everything out there at once. Karen's got power. She's got connections. We need to hit her where it hurts." Dave nodded, his mind racing. "But how do we do that? We can't just show up at her door with these photos and expect her to back off." Brad's lips twisted into a grim smile. "No, but we can show the rest of the neighborhood what kind of person she is. We're going to expose her for what she is. Someone who manipulates, who abuses her power to bully and control. We make sure everyone knows what she's been doing, and we turn the community against her." Dave felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The idea of turning an entire neighborhood against someone was both exhilarating and terrifying. Could they really do it? Could they bring Karen down, expose her as the fraud she was? Brad's next words cut through his thoughts. "We're going to use the HOA meeting tonight, the one she's going to be at. It's the perfect chance to present everything we've gathered. And we need to make sure it lands hard." The HOA meeting. The mere thought of it made Dave's pulse race. He had never been to one of those meetings, but he had heard plenty of stories from the drivers about how Karen ran them with an iron fist. She was the queen of the HOA, the one everyone feared. And now, they were going to use that very fear against her. Brad's voice dropped to a whisper, almost like a secret. "I've got a few neighbors who are going to back us up. They've got their own evidence, their own stories. And when we present everything at the meeting tonight, we'll be ready." Dave nodded, feeling a spark of hope. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was part of something bigger, something that could actually change the tide. He had always hated the idea of being a pawn, of being pushed around by people like Karen. But now he was in control. He could see it now. The neighborhood united, standing up to the woman who had terrorized them for so long. The evening came quickly, and as Dave stood outside the community center, the nerves inside him began to claw at his chest. This was it, the moment they had been preparing for. He wasn't just some delivery guy anymore. Tonight, he was going to stand up, to confront Karen, and to make sure the whole community saw her for what she truly was. Inside, the lights were dimmed, and the hum of low conversations buzzed around him. He could hear Karen's unmistakable voice cutting through the noise, commanding the attention of everyone in the room. Her presence was palpable, like a cloud that hung heavy over everything. She was the center of it all, the queen of the HOA, and no one dared challenge her. But tonight, everything was about to change. Dave slipped into a seat near the back of the room, the folder still clutched in his hands, his eyes scanning the room. The walls were lined with familiar faces, neighbors, other delivery drivers, a few local business owners. Brad was sitting a few rows ahead of him, his eyes locked on Karen, who was perched at the front, her smug expression betraying the fact that she thought she had this whole thing under control. Dave leaned forward, his heart thumping in his chest. His plan was simple: wait for the right moment, present the evidence, and watch as Karen's world started to unravel. He felt the weight of the folder grow heavier in his hands, but this time, it wasn't a burden, it was his weapon. The meeting started, and Karen immediately took charge, rattling off the latest updates on neighborhood rules, trying to exert her dominance. But Dave barely heard her. His eyes were fixed on the clock. The timing had to be perfect. Then it happened. The moment of opportunity arrived. Karen made a subtle gesture to her loyal followers, a signal that she was about to present a new initiative, something that would likely send the neighborhood into a tailspin. The air in the room grew tense, the room quieting as Karen took a breath to speak. Dave's pulse raced. This was the opening he needed. He stood up, his voice breaking through the murmur of conversation. "Actually," he said, his voice steady but firm, "I think it's time we talk about something else. Something a little more important." Karen froze, her eyes narrowing as she shot a glance in his direction. "What is this, Dave?" she demanded, her tone dripping with the familiar condescension. Dave took a step forward, holding the folder high. "I think the neighborhood deserves to know who you really are, Karen. I think they deserve to know how you've been using your position to bully and control people. I've got evidence, photos, records, everything you've done to ruin people's lives." A gasp rippled through the room, and Dave's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. The silence that followed was deafening, the weight of his words hanging in the air like a ticking time bomb. Karen's face contorted with rage as she stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. "You think you can just come in here and destroy everything I've worked for? You're a fool, Dave." But Dave didn't flinch. He was done being afraid. "I'm not the fool," he said, his voice ringing through the room. "You are." As the room erupted into whispers and gasps, Dave's eyes met Brad's across the room. Brad gave him a small, approving nod. The battle lines had been drawn, and there was no turning back now. The war had begun, and Karen had just lost the first round. The room fell into a stunned silence, the weight of Dave's words hanging in the air like a thick fog. Karen's face, once flushed with arrogance, was now drained of color. Her mouth opened and closed, as though searching for words that would give her back the control she so desperately clung to. But Dave wasn't finished. He couldn't afford to be. This was the moment he'd been waiting for, the moment everything could change. With a measured breath, he dropped the folder onto the table in front of him, the papers rustling with the impact. Every set of eyes in the room turned to it, some confused, some curious, but all equally transfixed by the gravity of the situation. Dave's fingers brushed over the photos as he spoke again, his voice cold but clear. "I've got photos of Karen here, complaints she's filed with the HOA, threatening emails she's sent to neighbors, even recorded conversations of her harassing residents, just for parking in front of her house, he said, his eyes never leaving Karen's now seething face. This is who you've been listening to. This is the person you've been letting rule this neighborhood with fear and manipulation. Karen's eyes flashed with fury, but there was something else there too. Fear. It was a brief flicker, a crack in her polished armor. And Dave saw it. The powerful Karen, the one who had spent years pushing everyone around her, was beginning to realize she wasn't invincible. The walls were closing in on her. "Dave, you don't know what you're doing," Karen hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "You have no idea the trouble you're about to cause. You're nothing compared to me." Her words were a last-ditch attempt at intimidation, but they landed with far less impact than they once would have. The room was already alive with murmurs, whispers of disbelief, outrage, and curiosity. Neighbors exchanged looks, some leaning forward to get a better view of the evidence, others standing in silent support of Dave. Brad stood up from his seat, his eyes burning with the same resolve that had driven him to contact Dave in the first place. "Actually, Karen, we do know exactly what we're doing, and it's you who doesn't have a clue anymore. Your reign of terror is over." The crowd seemed to shift, their attention now fully on Karen. For the first time in years, she was the one under scrutiny. The small suburban kingdom she'd built for herself was starting to crumble, piece by piece, and it was happening in front of everyone. Karen's jaw clenched as she glanced around the room, her pride fighting against the reality she was now facing. "This is slander," she spat, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "You can't just accuse me of these things without proof. I'll make sure you regret this." But her words didn't hold the same weight anymore. In fact, they sounded hollow, desperate. The more she tried to cling to her power, the more the truth seemed to pierce through her facade. Dave shook his head. "This isn't slander, Karen. This is the truth. And the truth has a way of coming out, no matter how hard you try to bury it." The room seemed to pulse with energy, a wave of momentum building as more people stood up to speak, to ask questions, to demand answers. The tide had turned, and Karen was sinking fast. A man from the back of the room, someone Dave had seen at local barbecues, but had never really spoken to, stood up. "I've had enough of her and her nonsense," he said, his voice shaking with frustration. "She tried to fine me for having a small tree in my yard. I've got photos too. I've been documenting everything she's done. And I'm not the only one." One by one, more neighbors stood up, their voices coming together in a chorus of condemnation. It was like a dam had broken. People who had once been too scared to speak out were now finding their voice, their anger rising to the surface. Dave could feel the change in the air, a palpable sense of solidarity, a wave of collective defiance that was sweeping through the room. Karen's face twisted in rage, but even she couldn't ignore the undeniable truth. Her empire was crumbling, and she had no one left to control. Her supporters, the few who still believed in her, were growing fewer by the second. Dave could practically hear the sound of the last of her power slipping away. But she wasn't going down without a fight. "You think this changes anything?" she snarled, glaring at Dave with venom. "You think you can just ruin me like this? I'll have you all blacklisted. You'll never work in this town again." Her threats were met with a collective laugh. One by one, the neighbors began to speak up, their voices cutting through Karen's tirade like a knife. "You've already tried that with Dave, Karen. Didn't work out too well for you, did it?" Brad's voice rang out, dripping with sarcasm. In fact, it just made him a hero in this neighborhood. The room erupted in laughter, and even Dave couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone she tried to control, everyone she tried to destroy. Karen stood, her face flushed with rage, her fists clenched at her sides. "You'll regret this," she hissed, her eyes burning with venom. "I will not go down quietly." But as she stormed out of the room, her threats growing quieter with each step, something changed in the air. The moment she left, A weight lifted from the shoulders of everyone in that room. They had won. Dave stood in the center of the room, his chest heaving, his heart racing with a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. It wasn't over, not yet, but the first battle had been fought and won. And for the first time in a long time, Dave felt like he was in control of his own fate. But he knew this was just the beginning. Karen wouldn't give up so easily, and there was no telling what she would do next. But one thing was certain: the fight had only just begun. The storm was coming, and Dave was ready for it. The following days felt like a strange, suspenseful lull, the calm before the storm. After the HOA meeting, the atmosphere in the neighborhood had shifted. There was a buzz in the air, a collective energy that couldn't be ignored. Karen's once unshakable grip on the community was loosening, and everyone could feel it. The whispers, the quiet support, the subtle smiles exchanged on porches and driveways. Something had changed. But Karen wasn't going down without a fight. Her threats to have Dave and others blacklisted, her insistence that she could still control the situation, had only fueled her desperation. Dave had expected her to make a big move, to try something drastic to regain her power. What he hadn't expected was how quickly things would escalate. It was late afternoon when the first sign of trouble appeared. Dave had just finished a delivery and was about to head home when he saw the flashing lights of a police car pull into his driveway. His stomach dropped. "This is it," he thought. "She's retaliating." The officer, a tall man with a stern face, stepped out of the car and approached Dave. "You Dave Daniels?" he asked, his voice all business. "Yeah, that's me. What's this about?" Dave replied, trying to keep his voice steady, though his heart was racing. "We've received a complaint," the officer said, glancing at a clipboard in his hands. "There's been an accusation made that you've been harassing a local resident, specifically one Karen Winslow." Dave's pulse quickened. "Harassing her? I've never harassed her." "We have a formal complaint," the officer cut him off. "We'll need you to come with us. It's about a recent incident." Dave's blood ran cold. He knew exactly what Karen had done. This wasn't just a complaint. It was part of her last-ditch effort to destroy him, to ruin everything he had worked for. She was pulling out all the stops, trying to make him look like the villain in front of the entire neighborhood. But Dave wasn't going down that easily. He stood firm, his mind racing as he thought through his options. He knew this was the fight of his life, the moment where everything would either fall apart or finally break Karen's stranglehold on the neighborhood. "I'm not going anywhere until I speak with my lawyer," Dave said, his voice strong, surprising even himself. "You can't take me in without proper cause." The officer's eyes narrowed. "We're just following up on a complaint. It's routine." Dave refused to back down. "I'm not leaving my house. If Karen wants to press charges, let her do it properly. I'm not a criminal." The officer hesitated for a moment, glancing at his partner who had been standing at the car. Finally, with a reluctant nod, he spoke again. "All right, but if you're not coming with us, we'll need you to be available for questioning. This isn't over." With that, the officer turned, and without another word, the squad car backed out of the driveway and drove off, the noise of the engine fading into the distance. Dave let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his legs feeling like they were about to give way. The adrenaline was still coursing through his veins, but the immediate threat had passed. Karen's move had been expected, and yet Dave had stood his ground. But there was no time to relax. He knew that Karen would be back, and with more tricks up her sleeve. This fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next day, things took a turn he hadn't anticipated. A local journalist, someone Dave had never met but knew by reputation, approached him at his front door. The man, a sharp-eyed reporter named Ethan Grant, had been covering local stories for years. He had seen the fallout from the HOA meeting, heard the murmurs about Karen's sudden downfall, and had tracked Dave down for a conversation. "I heard you've got a story that needs to be told," Ethan said, holding up a notepad and a camera. Dave, still recovering from the previous day's encounter, was caught off guard. "What do you mean?" Ethan smiled, his eyes gleaming with interest. "I've been following the story of Karen Winslow for a while now. The complaints, the harassment, the bullying. It's all adding up. But you've got the evidence, the real proof. And the whole neighborhood is starting to realize what she's been doing. People are fed up." Dave paused, considering his options. This wasn't just about his personal fight anymore. This had become a neighborhood-wide battle, one that could have ripple effects far beyond what he'd imagined. "I'm not looking for a fight," Dave said carefully. "But if you want the truth, then yes, I've got it. And I think people deserve to know." Ethan nodded. "You're not alone in this, Dave. There's a whole community of people who've been waiting for someone to stand up to her. I can help you get the word out, bring the truth to light." The weight of Ethan's offer hung in the air. Dave could feel the gears turning, the momentum building. This could be the final piece, the move that would shatter Karen's power for good. But it wouldn't be easy. It never was. By that evening, a story had hit the local news, complete with photos, testimonies, and evidence. The headline read, "Local HOA leader accused of bullying and abuse of power. The untold story." The video footage showed Karen's interactions with neighbors, her harsh demands, her intimidation tactics, and the evidence from Dave's folder was all over the screen. Every photo, every email, every damning detail. The neighborhood was waking up to the truth, and Karen's world was crumbling faster than she could react. The following days were a blur. The police were involved. The HOA had been forced to address the situation, and neighbors began organizing to have Karen removed from her position. The support for Dave was overwhelming, and the realization that they were finally standing together felt like a wave of relief washing over the community. Karen's last attempt at control came in the form of a final, desperate email to Dave, threatening legal action, vowing to destroy him. But this time, the email was ignored. The damage had been done. The truth had been exposed. As the dust settled and the neighborhood began to heal, Dave looked out over the street from his front porch. The world felt different, lighter, freer. He had stood up to the bully, and he had won. And in doing so, he had not only reclaimed his life, but helped the entire community find its voice. It wasn't just about the pizza delivery anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. And for the first time in a long time, Dave felt truly at peace. The storm had passed, and the future looked brighter than ever.